Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really provocative theory about how civil unrest in America is fundamentally changing. We're going to be looking directly at a recent interview featuring Hoover Institution senior fellow Victor Davis Hanson. Now, to be clear, our goal here isn't to pick a political side. We just want to unpack how exactly Hanson builds his argument. Because honestly, understanding this hypothesis gives us a fascinating lens to view today's political discourse, no matter where you personally stand. All right, let's just get right into it.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're looking at the new face of unrest, the idea of a top-down revolt, the psychology of resentment, the assimilation argument, misidentifying the threat, and finally the political mainstream. Starting with Section 1, the new face of unrest. Let's look at the historical versus the modern. So to really grasp Hanson's argument, we first need to look at how he completely redefines a political uprising. Think about history, right? Going back to the Industrial Revolution, uprisings were almost always driven by the working class. They were fueled by genuine, grinding poverty and a desperate need for basic survival, stuff like rice and beans. But Hanson says modern unrest? It's a totally different animal. When we see modern swarming or looting, we're rarely seeing desperate people breaking into grocery stores just to eat. Instead, they're going after luxury goods. We're talking high-end sneakers, expensive jewelry. So his argument is that this isn't a revolt of the poor at all, but actually something far more affluent.
Moving on to Section 2, the top-down revolt. Let's look at who is actually protesting.
Okay, so if it's not the traditional working class out there, who exactly is in the streets? Well, Hanson characterizes the modern protester as urban, affluent, and highly educated. We're talking folks with degrees in political science, sociology, or psychology. But, and here's the real friction, despite being super well-spoken and educated, they're often underemployed. They might be working at NGOs, maybe as junior editors. Hanson argues that these individuals basically feel cheated. They went to college, they spent the money, and they expected that expensive education to guarantee them a tech CEO's lifestyle. But reality hit, and instead they are burdened by massive student loans and completely priced out of the housing market. So they aren't living in poverty, but they are incredibly disappointed.
Which brings us to Section 3, the psychology of resentment. Expectation versus reality.
Now, this massive gap between what they expected and what they actually got leads directly into their psychological motivation. During the interview, the host, Will, brought up a quote from the Secretary of State that absolutely hits the nail on the head for Hanson's theme. It diagnoses this entire movement as being driven by resentment. It's framed as violence perpetrated by those who feel totally frustrated in their economic capacity, and it's directed at those who have succeeded. Hanson completely agrees with this. He sees this underlying, deep-seated bitterness as the actual engine driving modern unrest.
Hanson actually labels this state a prolonged adolescence. It's like, because these graduates can't hit those traditional adult milestones, buying a house, starting a family, they just remain in this kind of suspended adulthood. But the crucial thing here is that they don't blame themselves. Not at all. Their conclusion is, the system did this to me. And this total externalization of blame, just pushing it all outward, is exactly what Hanson sees as the psychological kindling for political violence.
Next up is Section 4, the assimilation argument, focusing on immigrant demographics. So right alongside those disillusioned college grads, Hanson points to a second, totally distinct demographic: recent first- and second-generation immigrants who, in his view, lean toward socialism. And what's super interesting here is that he places the blame for this entirely on the United States. He argues that a complete lack of assimilation efforts and civic education essentially means the host country just never asked anything of them. And because of that inaction, they tend to romanticize their former nations and demand these massive, systemic changes without really understanding American civic structures. According to Hanson, this creates a second, huge destabilizing layer to modern protests.
All right, Section 5, misidentifying the threat. Let's talk about the institutional disconnect.
So, if these are the specific groups driving the unrest, how on earth are major institutions reacting? Well, Hanson perceives a massive, glaring societal disconnect here. Official institutions are continually warning us about one type of threat. For example, former DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano warning about returning veterans, or President Biden and the Pentagon explicitly citing white supremacists. Yet Hanson counters this by saying that exhaustive studies find absolutely nothing to support those specific fears. Instead, he claims the actual insidious threats are entirely left-wing. We're talking Antifa, BLM, communists, and democratic socialists. Basically, he argues the establishment is literally looking in the exact opposite direction of the real danger.
You might be wondering, why would these massive institutions get it so incredibly wrong?
Hanson explains this using something he calls the utopian vision. He says these radical groups operate under these grand ideological banners of equality and fairness. And because their stated goals sound so universally noble, they effectively create a shield against institutional criticism. They essentially get a free pass from the media and the establishment, even if, according to Hanson, their actual methods on the ground are incredibly violent and destructive. Getting a handle on this strategy is absolutely key to understanding how certain narratives completely dominate the modern media landscape while others just get brushed aside.
And finally, Section 6, the political mainstream, and how this is infiltrating parties.
The absolutely crucial point here is that these fringe elements don't just stay out on the streets. They are bleeding directly into formal mainstream politics. Hanson contends that mainstream political factions are increasingly serving as a literal front for these movements. He specifically argues that groups like Antifa are basically just the acceptable face of a violent movement that has successfully infiltrated the Democratic Party. And this close proximity, he suggests, is exactly why you so rarely see mainstream politicians standing up and loudly condemning the unrest.
To ground this whole theory in reality, the host, Will, points to a really recent example, the public reaction to Luigi Mangione. Will highlights the pockets of public celebration for Mangione as a glaring, real-world emblem of this exact phenomenon in action. For Hanson and Will, this serves as undeniable proof that politically motivated violence isn't just becoming normalized. In some highly educated circles, it's actually being openly celebrated.
Which leaves us with this final, really critical thought to chew on. We've just walked through Hanson's entire hypothesis, from debt-ridden graduates to unassimilated immigrants and major institutions that allegedly just look the other way. So, ask yourself, how will this massive demographic shift, moving from a working class seeking basic needs to a college-educated class demanding a complete systemic overhaul, how will that alter our political future? Whether you view this as a dangerous top-down revolt or a completely legitimate cry for economic fairness, there is really no denying that the face of unrest has fundamentally changed. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep questioning the structures around you, and we'll see you next time.